Okay, I'm making a third and final Thin Blue Line video. I didn't expect to talk this long, but at the same time, since we're not meeting at all in person, I'm just trying to give you a little help wading through some of the material in this film. Um, so I'm going to skip to talking about the judge, Don Metcalf. And this might involve some things regarding the DA, Douglas Mulder, as well. So, question 11 says, what do we find out about Judge Don Metcalf? What's the significance of the story he tells about his father? What remark did he reportedly make to Dennis White's wife about Randall Adams? Okay, so we encounter Judge Don Metcalf in the film, and there are times where he says things that sound like sort of respectable statements, where he says something about, as a judge, I have to try to maintain an appearance of objectivity on the bench and things like that. And that sounds very, noble in a way. But at the same time, one of the first things that we encounter when we hear from him is that he starts telling this story about his father. And he says that his father was a member of the FBI when he was growing up, when Don Metcalf was growing up. And he tells us this whole story about how his dad was in the FBI at a time when it was particularly dangerous to be an FBI agent, because this was a time of sort of gangsters and Chicago, and he even tells a story about John Dillinger. John Dillinger was a famous bank robber, and just like criminal at large. And one of those criminals, I don't know, kind of like Jesse James in the West, or Al Capone or something, where there have been movies made about it. I mean, there's a movie about John Dillinger, starring Johnny Depp plays John Dillinger, and I think the name of the movie is Public Enemies. So all of it's to say, John Dillinger had a little bit of this like mystique of the mystique of a famous gangster that Hollywood would go on to make movies about and stuff. So Judge Don Metcalf gets all into sort of telling this story about how his father was one of the cops chasing down Dillinger, one of the FBI agents chasing down Dillinger. And in fact, that his father was there the night, law enforcement finally caught and killed Dillinger. And by then it had been depicted in movies, and we see clips from one of the movies in Errol Morris's movie. And it happened at the Biograph Theater in Chicago. And it's almost like this mythology where there was the lady in red who fingered John Dillinger. In other words, she told the cops, that guy over there is John Dillinger, and because I know you guys are looking for him. And that's how the cops tracked him down and eventually shot and killed him, right? So Metcalf gets into this whole story, and then he adds this detail at the end. The lady in red was really wearing orange. And he says, so she became to be known as the lady in red, but my dad was there and he saw that she was wearing orange, so she was really wearing orange. And then he ends by saying, and as a reward for helping the police catch Dillinger, they gave her a fur coat and a one-way ticket back to her native Romania. And then Errol Morris flashes a map of Romania on the screen. Might be puzzling. Why the hell is this in the movie, right? What the hell does this have to do with anything? Well, one thing is, and this is my interpretation, but this struck me that one other place in the film where we see a map is we see a map of Dallas, Texas. And there's a very logical reason we do, which is that this is where the crime took place. But when we see the map of Romania, I think it highlights the fact that Don Metcalf has gotten us way off on a tangent that really has nothing to do with this case that we're trying to get to the bottom of, a case which he oversaw the trial of. And yet we're off on this fantastical tangent. So part of it is it could be a little bit of a comment by Errol Morris saying, why the hell are we going off on these crazy fantastical tangents? But the other part of it is, if you think about it, the story is about what a dangerous job his father had in law enforcement. And there's even a moment later on in the film where Judge Don Metcalf is talking, and he says, I can understand if a 17-year-old kid steals a car because he doesn't have a car to ride around in. And he says, I can understand why a kid who, didn't have any money steals some money so he has some money. Something like that. And then he ends the little sort of train of thought by saying, but what I can understand is why someone would shoot a cop. And he says, because shooting a police officer just doesn't have to happen, or just shouldn't happen, or something like that. Now, I'm not disagreeing with him about the fact that somebody shouldn't shoot a cop. I mean, I don't think it's a good thing to do. I think it's a very bad thing to do. But it is interesting that the judge says, I can understand why a 17-year-old kid would steal a car to ride around in. I mean, the truth is, he's a judge. He's not supposed to understand why a 17-year-old kid would steal a car. He's supposed to hold car thieves accountable, right? Or whatever other crimes he lists. It's also interesting because David Harris was probably 17 by the time the trial was happening. So it sounds in a way like and David Harris had stolen a car. So it sounds like in a way he's talking about David Harris. He doesn't say David Harris's name, but it sounds like he's talking about David Harris. And though David Harris committed these crimes, like stealing a car and robbing a convenience store, the judge seems to be justifying those crimes and then saying, but there's a special crime where that's particularly bad, where people should be held accountable, and that is the crime of killing a cop. But there he doesn't seem to be talking about the same person. He seems to be talking about Adams there. I mean, he doesn't say it explicitly. But I say it to say, that doesn't sound like objectivity. That sounds like he's making rationalizations and justifications for going easy on some people and going hard on others. And I say it to say, if you also take it back to the story about John Dillinger and all that, he's telling a sort of mythical story about how dangerous it is to be a police officer. So, again, he's putting an extra emphasis on that. Let me add to it one more dimension, which is the judge also later tells us about that when the DA Douglas Mulder got up to make his closing arguments, he made this argument using the phrase that ends up becoming the title of this movie, which is that Douglas Mulder says, the police are the thin blue line that separates the public from anarchy. And what I think that means in a way is, the reason it's a thin blue, it's a blue line because it's police. The reason it's a thin blue line is, there are never enough police to, that there aren't that many police relative to the population of the country. And so it's thin, it's tenuous, but, by Mulder's argument, it's really important because it separates the public, all the citizens of the country, from anarchy, meaning total chaos. It's a way of romanticizing the police. I'm not saying that it's utterly untrue, but it's a way of trying to characterize what the police do in an almost poetic or idealized way. It also makes it sound like all they do are noble things. And of course, if if Adam's story about Gus Rose is true, that is not a romanticized or like idealized version of the cops. That's a version of the cops where it shows us some cops exploit their power and don't do the right thing. I am not suggesting all cops are like that, but we might see some cops in this movie that are like that. That, you know, you need to sort through that and figure out what you think about that. But what I would say is, when the judge hears this story about the nobility of the thin blue line of police that separate the public from anarchy, I mean, that what he's saying in a way is, without the police, the country would just be in anarchy. Okay, but the judge tells us that when he heard this argument on the bench, tears filled his eyes. And I guess if I asked it as a question, what I would say is that objectivity? If you're so moved by this sort of metaphor one side of the case uses, that your eyes fill with tears, does that indicate objectivity? I don't think so. Let's add to that one more detail, which is in answer to the last question from 11, number 11 on the sheet of questions here. It says, what remark did the judge reportedly make to Dennis White's wife? And this is according to Edith James, who is Adam's other lawyer. She says that according to Dennis White's wife, her name's Jeanette White, that at one point the judge said to her about Adams, "What do you care about him? He's only a drifter." Now, if you don't know the term drifter, it's a derogatory term for someone who's just passing through. Adams isn't from Texas. He's from Ohio, and he's just living in a motel there because he and his brother were driving from Ohio, and they were going to head to California, but they stopped to get jobs and make a little more money before they continue on to California. And so if this story from Dennis White's wife is true, that the judge is basically saying, why do you even care about him? He's only a drifter. Well, that is, if that story is true, that is not the judge being objective or doing his job. Your job, he might be a drifter, though it's a derogatory term, but even if you just accept it, like he's just passing through, he's still an American citizen, he still has rights. Just because he's a drifter doesn't mean you can violate his rights. So what do you care about him? The judge should care that justice is being carried out. If that story's true, it would certainly suggest that he's not very invested in that. So look, there's a lot more we could talk about. The witnesses are really important, and I would just pay attention to Robert and Emily Miller. Pay attention to what Elba Carr says about Robert and Emily Miller. She worked with them at the gas station. She tells us what Robert Miller said the day after the shooting. She then tells us what Robert Miller said once he saw that they were giving a reward for information about, anyone who saw anything that night. Listen to what Emily Miller tells us. Listen to what Michael Randall, the other witness, says. Okay? That's all very important stuff to get to the bottom of what happened. There's the stuff about the psychiatrist. There's other stuff about the DA, Douglas Mulder, etc. So anyway, I hope all the stuff I've talked about helps, but we're trying to sort through all these potentially contradictory stories to find within this movie the most plausible explanation of what happened, and that's what you'll discuss in your paper, which I'll assign soon. Thanks.